Thank you so much for having me. It's nice to be back at Nudgestock. I remember the last time I was there in person, and it was quite an event. So this is quite an odd experience we're having. I think it's very important to understand that we are experiencing a once-in-a-century event. Something very unusual is happening to us in our life as a species. We are experiencing a new pathogen being introduced into our midst. And this pathogen is having what is known in evolutionary biology as an ecological release. It's an invasive species to us. It's as if we went to an isolated island in the Pacific and released rats onto the island and they overran the place. Our bodies are that island to the virus, which is the rats. And now this virus is going to circulate and circulate and circulate among us forever. And we know at this point quite a bit about this pathogen, but actually some of the key parameters we know about this pathogen are things we did know, as specialists knew, right at the beginning. For example, we know how infectious is this pathogen. It has something known as a basic reproduction number, an R naught, of about 3. That means intrinsically the virus, for each infected patient, is able to infect 3 new patients. And we also know the intrinsic lethality of the virus. We know that it kills between 0.5 and 0.8% of the people that it infects. If you get symptoms of the virus, it's about twice that, 1 to 1.6% of people. And of course, it varies by age. If you're younger than 20 and you get infected, you have a 1 in 10,000 chance of dying. If you're in your 50s, you've got about a 1% chance of dying. If you're in your 70s or 80s, you've got about a 20% chance of dying. But on average, let's say if you get symptomatic COVID, you've got about a 1% chance of dying. If you took just those 2 parameters, how infectious is the pathogen and how lethal is the pathogen, which are intrinsic properties of the pathogen, and you plotted those two properties for all respiratory pathogens for the last 100 years, let's say. So on the x-axis, how is the pathogen, and on the y-axis, how infectious is it? Up here in the upper right, you would have the 1918 influenza pandemic. Down here in the lower left, you might have the 2009 pandemic, which most of us don't remember because it just gave you the sniffles. Previously, right in the middle, you would have the 1957 influenza pandemic, which is the second worst worldwide pandemic we've had in the last 100 years. And now COVID would be between 57 and 18. It is the second worst respiratory pandemic we've had in the last 100 years. And you could have done this exercise back in January of 2020 and forecast much of what has happened in the world today. Now, while many of the things that we are, even the fact that we're meeting this way, for example, and so many other aspects of our lives seem so alien and unnatural, and they are those things, they are alien and unnatural from our point of view, we have to understand that plagues are not are a feature of human experience. Plagues are in the Bible. They're in the Iliad, right? The beginning of Homer's Iliad starts with a plague. They're in Shakespeare. They're in Cervantes. The important thing to understand is that what happened in 2020 was in fact not new to our species. Plagues are not new to our species. They're just new to us. We think it's crazy that we've had to come to live this way, but in fact, our species has been confronting it for thousands of years. In fact, what we see with this epidemic is that the great force of a deadly germ is once again meeting the enduring reality of our evolved social nature. This pathogen exploits some of our deepest, most fundamental qualities, our capacity to love each other, for example, and therefore to come together, to live socially, to have friends and form social networks. It exploits our desire to hug and touch each other. It even exploits our desire to come together in groups, to cooperate or learn from each other or teach each other things. In fact, in a very real way, the spread of germs is the price we pay for the spread of ideas. We evolved to come near each other and live socially, to work together and learn from each other, and the virus exploits that desire. But equally and ironically, the spread of ideas is how we are going to combat the virus. It's precisely because we can learn from the past, and precisely because right now, doctors and scientists and other people are working together to create knowledge to combat the virus, it is that ability to share ideas that is going to allow us to fight the virus. And so we must, and we are, sharing information across time and space about how to combat this epidemic. And we are learning from each other as ordinary members of society, affecting each other's knowledge, attitudes, and behaviors. And also, as experts, we are learning. Experts are learning from each other by sharing scientific information, by cooperating to invent new drugs and new vaccines, for example. Now, one of the important things to understand about plagues for thousands of years is that lies and denial have been constant companions to plagues. If you think of a plague as one of the four horsemen of the apocalypse, mendacity is its squire. Following right behind the germ is lies. And this has been the case for thousands of years. In fact, we might even say that denial and lies, the presence of denial and lies, is required for us to imagine that an epidemic is really taking place. And one can even think of these two processes, the spread of germs and the spread of lies, as subsumed under a set of ideas that my laboratory has called dueling contagions. So imagine a social network of people. Every dot is a person, and there are lines between them connecting those people. And across those lines, spreading from person to person, from dot to dot, are information, for example. So information can be spreading. I tell you, for example, about how to wear a mask, or whether to wear a mask, or where you can get a mask, for example. And that spreads from person to person. Or maybe I fill your ears with lies. I tell you, for example, that the vaccines have little, metallic nanoparticles, and they're being used by, billionaires to track us, for example, which is false. Or I tell you other misinformation that, if you inject yourself with bleach, for example, that might be beneficial. That is going to spread from person to person. And this information can spread through these networks in quantifiable ways that my laboratory and many other laboratories have been studying. Also, behavior spreads in quantifiable ways. For example, your risk of being vaccinated, or your probability to be vaccinated, depends on the probability of other people around you to be vaccinated. So, for example, if your friends get vaccinated, you think, oh, maybe that's a good idea. I should copy them. Or perhaps you learn where to get vaccinated, or you get more information about the nature of the side effects of the vaccine. It wasn't so bad. So your probability of being vaccinated depends upon whether your friends have or have not been vaccinated. So vaccination behavior spreads in social networks. And of course, germs spread in social networks, almost canonically. So the germ is spreading from person to person through the social network, and you should have the intuition that your probability of acquiring the germ depends on whether your friends have the germ or not. And in fact, the variants of concern are spreading in social networks. And it turns out that your probability of acquiring certain variants depends on whether or not you've acquired other variants. For instance, if you acquire a more benign variant of the disease, you might then be immunized against the more serious variants of the disease. Just like if you've been acquired information about the truth about the epidemic, you might be immunized against acquiring false information about the epidemic. So the first idea is that all of these things, information, behaviors, variants, are spreading the social network, and how they spread, and this can be understood just on that layer. But here's the answer. Those different layers of spreading can form a part of what we would call a dueling contagion. Think about the yes, whether you get the germ depends on whether your friends get the germ or have the germ, but also whether you get the germ depends on whether your friends have been vaccinated. You're more likely to get the virus if your friends have the virus, and you're less likely to get the virus if your friends are vaccinated. Your probability of being vaccinated can depend not just on whether your friends are vaccinated, but also on whether your friends have the germ or not. You might be more likely to get vaccinated if your friends get vaccinated, and you also might say, gee, everyone around me is getting sick. Maybe I should be vaccinated. So these layers of things that are spreading interfere with each other. in mathematically very complex and interesting ways. And you can actually build mathematical models of dueling social and biological contagions and ask yourself the question, which one is going to win out? Will truth or falsity win out as they're spreading? Will the benign or more toxic variants win out as they're spreading? Or will the virus win out against the spread of vaccination behavior? Can we spread masking and vaccination and other desirable behaviors faster or better, rather, than the virus in order to get ahead of this pathogen? So the dynamics of such interdependent spreading phenomena ultimately affect the course and outcome of the epidemic. If you're in the United States and you want to use a tool that my laboratory has made publicly available to track the spread of such phenomena, it's a little bit like Waze for coronavirus. It crowdsources information about where the virus is in your social network and combines it with publicly available information, and it can forecast your risk of encountering the virus in the future. So far, this app has only been released in the United States, but we may release it abroad. That app is called Hunala, Hunala, and it works to track the virus as it's moving through social networks. One of the other things that's interesting about the epidemic with respect to spreading is that it's not just these, let's say, more concrete things like the behaviors or information that spread. During an epidemic, meaning can spread, sort of abstract commitments that people have. And during times of plague for thousands of years, there is evidence that there is a heightened sense of meaning, which is not too surprising when walking in the street at home, the meaning of their lives. And they reflect about the purpose of a good society. And so we have seen such things in ancient times, often were manifested, for example, by a rise more religious than they used to be during the time of the epidemic. But there are other manifestations. For example, we've seen surging into medical professions, in people studying medicine or nursing, for example. We've seen essentially different ways. For example, the people driving our goods in trucks across the country now suddenly have a different
tweets.
All right.
Tweets in the studio. Back to us. Back to us. Back to the studio, because the lovely Nicholas Christakis, we're not quite sure. We haven't got to the bottom of it yet. Is all of sea containers just overheating? Are we not used to the sunshine? And is it America that's overheating? We don't know yet. We can't work it quite out. But what I can tell you is we've got some beautiful tweets coming in live, and we've managed to put those on a couple of slides for you. So what have we been seeing online on social? What's this from Joel Bailey? Missed my 15 seconds of fame at Nudgestock 2021 because I had to pick up the kids.
This is Joel, I think, who was driving down the M4 while he was listening to us earlier this morning. So big thanks, Joel, and pleased to hear you got to your destination safely there.
And both hands were on the wheel. Thames Valley Police, big client of ours. Big shout out to those guys. We also made sure that we were security checked with the keys earlier, and they were pleased with us about that. What else have we got here?
We have
Dave
David
Anderson,
who's watching.
Pfizer boy.
Who thinks he might be in a cult now. So we'll unpack that over the course of the day. While we like to be influential, we hope it's not that influential to the degree we've moved.
Oh, speak for yourself, Sam. Speak for yourself. Sign up. It's apparently an excellent way to make money and run the world. So yes, the cult of Nudgestock, it started here with Dave. And send us, buy us some T-shirts to start with. That's a good start, isn't it?
And then we moved to Jake Courage.
Oh,
lovely
lovely
something
Jake.
that we saw a lot last year. It's good to see children getting involved in behavioural science very early, and I think this is a shot. If you missed it and you're dialing in now, a conversation that Rory just had with Daniel Kahneman, Nobel Prize winning psychologist, just an hour or so ago. So great to see starting them young, and huge thanks for tweeting us, Jake.
I saw some other babies on the feed earlier as well. And then what have we got here? The Keto Me, Nudgestock 2021, this reminds me of the time in the 90s when I, as a kid, sprinted between my Cartoon Network / cricket breaks to pee and get back onto the seat in record time, watching one on the big screen in high definition. I'm not at all ready for my close-up, but we're glad to be entertaining you on the big screen today. And this is Glastonbury for Nerds. I think that might be our favourite frame of the day, Glastonbury for Nerds.
It is, and as we zoom out, it's a global Glastonbury.
Oh.
So I think we have Chris behind us.
Haha! Chris is here and with us in the studio. Excellent.
Now, Nicholas Christakis, we're working to get him back on. He is a giant in network social theory and dynamics, as you saw. I've been studying his works, going back to reading about his work related to looking at the so-called Framingham data. That was a town in Massachusetts, Framingham, Massachusetts, which was studied longitudinally for decades for health, mapping each person through those decades. And he came up with an astounding finding, which essentially that obesity as a kind of contagion. And you can think of smoking as a kind of contagion. And he found that how over time people would move out to the edge of some of these networks with others just like them. Hence his telling us just now the importance of looking at this plague as a social phenomenon as well, whether we're more vulnerable or less vulnerable, but also this dual contagion that Nicholas is talking about, not just the literal getting a sick contagion, but the contagion of disinformation and conspiracy theory, which is so tied to our own social networks and our identity. And you're going to see something very interesting a little later in Nudgestock with Damon Santola, formerly of MIT and now at Annenberg, where he, like Nicholas and Nicholas's team, are tracking this dynamism within social networks to get deeper insights as to how we pass behavior from person to person, node to node, and it's not necessarily what we used to think it was. So let's get right into the questions then. I think you may have heard me talking about your amazing work through the years and tracking contagion in social networks. What, if anything, given that we've had many, many plagues, but this is a very different one because of our ability not only to connect, but track connections, what do you think is different this time when it comes to the social aspect of how we enable things like disinformation?
Well, I think my general argument would be that disinformation has been a feature of plagues for thousands of years. You know, we're not the first ones to spread rumors and superstitions, to engage in lies and denial. Yes, we have new tools you're right, that can communicate this information more rapidly. We always had the capacity for echo chambers. So we're doing that too, in a way that's to our detriment. I think the primary way in which the speed with which we can share information has affected the course of this epidemic has been with respect to our ability to invent a vaccine. We are perhaps the first generation of human beings alive who have been able in real time to work together to develop a manifestly effective treatment for the thing that's killing us, and to deploy it speedily enough that it might actually change the course of the epidemic. During the Black Death, they thought, they had these ideas that if you took snakes and minced up a snake and minced up onions and made a paste of onions and snakes and rubbed it on your body, that would ward off the epidemic. Of course, it did nothing of the kind. So people always thought they could invent treatments to stop it, but we actually can. And I do think our communication technology has facilitated that to some extent.
Now, I'm really rattled, Nicholas, because I have been using minced up snake and onion for years and slathering it over my body, and I still haven't caught COVID, so that must prove that it works, right? No,
yeah,
but truly,
that's very effective. But
and you can tell I'm following. Go ahead.
I was just going to say, there is a serious debate. I mean, there's no doubt that the vaccine is miraculous and effective. And it is going to have an impact, certainly globally. But if you look, for example, at the number of deaths in many European countries or in the United States, Um, we've had quite a few. We've had almost as many as we might have had had we remained unvaccinated. So the forecasts, I think, were that we would lose between 500,000 and 1 million Americans due to the vaccine, due to the intrinsic properties of the pathogen. So we're definitely gonna cut the loss of life, and we're certainly going to get sort of up to speed, restore normal economic interactions more quickly. But I don't think the vaccine has arrived, even though it's miraculous, fast enough to stop the epidemic. It hasn't done that.
Well, and to the point of the vaccine, I work in vaccine hesitancy field, and vaccines are useless unless you get them in arms. And we see that we've been pretty good about getting first doses out, particularly amongst those who are 65 plus. But there are gaps of either inequity or gaps of vaccine hesitancy. And vaccine hesitancy, interestingly, is no longer an information deficit problem. It's an identity issue as well.
Yes.
And this is something that I lived through SARS in Hong Kong. And I never saw this. It's a very collectivist society. So I never saw this individualist cleaving of society around things like mask wearing and vaccinations. And now that you can actually see it as a symbol of the enemy tribe. Go ahead.
Well, we looked at vaccine hesitancy in India with respect to polio vaccines years ago, and we mapped the social networks in these very large urban areas. So who's connected to who? And then if you can imagine a series of dots and lines, and then let's say you paint the dots according to whether they have want the polio vaccine or do not want it, are vaccine hesitant, you actually can see clusters in the network of vaccine hesitant and non-hesitant individuals, as if there's a flow of information about the utility or benefits of a vaccine or the desirability of a vaccine, or a kind of social norming effect, just like you mentioned. So it's always, I think, been the case that there's been social influence with respect to vaccine uptake. But what I think is a little bit new is the politicization of this phenomenon, where it becomes part of your political identity, whether or not you get the vaccine. And that is a very worrisome and I think actually somewhat modern phenomenon.
Yeah, it does tie into a larger narrative, which I'm going to talk about separately right after this, that also comes out of Yale with your colleague Dan Kahan and the Cultural Cognition Project. And I'm going to talk a little bit about how we split along these lines of worldview in ways just as we could have predicted, perhaps in the United States, on mask wearing specifically, that seeing it as abridging liberties and freedom of choice. Are you seeing, when you map social networks, beyond the proximity of who is close to whom, do you also map it by things like worldview to see where they connect beyond the physical?
Yeah, so I mean, there are a number of ways in which attributes of individuals, their sex or their age or their political affiliation or their religious affiliation, of course, predict their beliefs about a whole host of things, including about COVID. And so there's no doubt about that. And to the extent that such individuals cluster within social networks, to the extent, for example, that there's preferential formation of ties, if people of one religion have more likely to have friends of people of that same religion, for example, then you're going to find in the network these types of clusters by these attributes. And therefore, partly for that reason, you're also going to find clusters of COVID-related behaviors like masking behavior. Right now in the United States, we have a serious problem with under-vaccination in white evangelical Christians and Republicans. Those are the groups that are primarily refusing vaccination. And it's not just a question of what if they refuse, how it affects they themselves. Of course, vaccination is a collective good. You get vaccinated not just for yourself, but for your friends and your neighbors and your family and your society. It's a little bit like paying taxes. And so I think that, I think there are other reasons people should want to get vaccinated, regardless of their own selfish motivations. So I think such an appeal could potentially work in such groups.
And we probably blew it at the beginning when we framed everything as an altruistic collectivist ideal in our behavior. And in fact, there's a parody online of all of those in our business of agencies making their clients ads of "we're all in this together." But when you look at somebody who's very individualistic, not necessarily selfish, but sees the world in a very individualistic lens, they're not all in this together with people they don't know and people they think are trying to impose rules on them that they don't want to see as abridging their liberties and freedoms. So it may have been a real-time lesson in customization of messaging in social networks. Do you think?
Yes, I absolutely think. And I think, there are other principles which are crucial when talking to someone who disagrees with you, or if you're trying, and as I'm sure many in this audience know, you're trying to persuade someone about the truth of some situation, or even just the truth as you see it. The first step, I think, is to join with them, to find areas of agreement. So if you explore someone's hesitation and they say to you, I think the vaccine was developed very rapidly, and that concerns me. And you can say, well, you're right. It was developed rapidly. I mean, that's not a false perception. Or if they say, I'm worried about the side effects, and you could say, you're right. It's understandable that you would be concerned about side effects of the vaccine. But, let me tell you something else. And I think, first of all, trying to identify areas of agreement with people with whom you disagree is very helpful as a general principle of persuasion. But going back to your original point, I do think you're right also that different sorts of appeals, whether, a kind of individualistic benefit. For example, right now there's a ad campaign that portrays getting vaccinated as like a tough guy thing to do, but it's very egocentrically framed. It's not so much framed as a kind of altruistic act. It's like be tough against the virus, use weapons, use whatever weapons you have available to protect yourself against this thing. So different framing can help, of course.
And I think this is where, when you look at people in our business and communications, and I work with WHO and UNICEF, and when you look at all of those looking to do goodwill work in communications with academics, there's not a lot of diversity. And I don't mean racial diversity or ethnic diversity. We all tend to gravitate towards the same worldview, which is a much more communitarian, more egalitarian view. And that's anathema to a hierarchical individualist. And so we really have to work harder at channeling them respectfully and talk about jobs and national security and things that might resonate rather than send signals we're from the enemy tribe trying to crush the economy.
I agree with everything you said, although I think even people like that have a sense that they don't want other people's liberty infringing on their own, right? I mean, your right to swing your hand at my nose. And the thing about a contagious disease is that it's contagious. It's not limited to you. Other people could spread it to you. You could frame it, okay, I'm here to talk to you about why the other guy should get vaccinated, why each individual has a duty to get vaccinated, because we don't want that other guy to infect you. And maybe it'll seep in that, gee, what applies to that other guy also applies to me.
One last thing you mentioned before we lost the video signal, the app. I want everybody to hear about it. I believe you called it Hunala. Is it Hunala?
Yes, Hunala. It's like Waze for coronavirus. We just released an update for the app. I think it'll be potentially especially useful in the winter when we will have another wave of this pandemic, not as bad as the last wave we just had in this winter, despite rising vaccination. I think it'll be useful to track your risk, to manage your risk, also to track variants of the virus. And it works, as I said, by you input a little data. It's a very privacy protecting app. It asks for access to your contact list, but it doesn't copy it. It's only to make it easier for you to identify who you interact with. And then it collects information from people about whether or not they have symptoms or have been vaccinated and so on, combines it with public information, and then feeds back to you as often as you want your risk of encountering the virus in the future. So it's not a contact tracing app which says, have you been exposed in the past? It's like Waze for coronavirus, a traffic app that tells you around the bend, you're going to see a slowdown in traffic. Around the bend, you might encounter the virus.
Dr. Nicholas Christakis, what a pleasure. Thank you for making the time. Thank you for coping and being resilient, enormously valuable. We're really grateful you joined us.